There are many theories contrary to what Mike has argued, but there isn't time tonight to look at them all. I will instead present the one theory I think is most probably correct, which I only have time to summarize. Shortly after the death of Jesus, his disciples prayed, meditated, and searched the scriptures for some meaning to justify the tragedy, and some way to preserve and promote the noble program of moral reform Jesus had died for. As a result, some had prophetic dreams or visions in which Jesus appeared to them, reassuring them and telling them just what they wanted to hear, that he had been raised by God, so all who attached themselves to him and his moral program would participate in his resurrection as soon as this good news was preached to all Israel. The relevant content of this belief was that Jesus had been granted a new body by God, the resurrection body promised to all the faithful, abandoning his old body to the grave like a shell or husk, to return to the dust from which it came. But the new body lived in heaven, from where Jesus would soon return on clouds of glory to give us our own new bodies at the end of days. Such, I believe, was the original belief. But the church quickly fragmented into competing sects with different agendas. And over the first century, some groups became more and more Gnostic, while others became more and more Sarsacistic. Gnosticism gravitated to the view that only the soul of Jesus was exalted, while Sarsacism was the opposite view, that Jesus was raised only in the flesh, in the very same body that died and was buried. I believe both views are distortions of what the original Christians believed, yet both arose at roughly the same time and pace. Just as the Gnostics developed novel legends to explain and justify their view of things, so did the Sarsacists. The canonical Gospels represent the parables and legends adopted or developed to serve the Sarsacist program, and that was the one and only sect to obtain total power and preserve for posterity its documents and its own version of history. That is my theory in rough outline. Now I have to explain why my theory is a better explanation of the facts than Mike's. There are 9 facts that together establish that my theory is more probably correct. Number 1, Paul contradicts the Gospels of Luke and John by describing a spiritual resurrection. This is significant because Paul's letters predate the writing of the Gospels and are the only sources recorded within 20 years of the death of Jesus. In addition, unlike the authors of the Gospels, Paul's name and identity is known to us with relative certainty, and he alone names his sources and confirms them as eyewitnesses. Therefore, what Paul says carries far more historical authority than the relatively anonymous documents written down decades later that relied on unnamed and unverified sources. Since the most relevant passage from 1 Corinthians 15 is so important, I will read an abridgment of it as I have translated from the Greek. But someone will say, "How are the dead raised, and with what kind of body do they come? You idiot, what you sow is not given life unless it dies, and what you sow, you do not sow the body that will come to be, but a naked seed, perhaps of wheat or something else. But God gives it a body, just as he pleased, and to each of the seeds he gives a body all its own. Not all flesh is the same flesh, but there is one sort of flesh for men, another flesh for cattle, another flesh for birds, and another for fish. There are also bodies in heaven and bodies on earth, but the glory of the heavenly ones is beyond the glory of the earthly ones. There is one glory for the sun, another glory for the moon, etc. So also is the resurrection of the dead. A natural body is sown, but a spiritual body is raised. So also is it written, the first man, Adam, turned into a living life form, but the last Adam into a life-giving spirit. But the spiritual body is not first. Rather, first comes the natural body, then the spiritual body. The first man is made of dust from the earth. The second man is made of something from heaven. As is the one of dust, so also are those of dust. And as is the one in heaven, so also are those in heaven. And just as we once wore the image of the one of dust, let us also come to wear the image of the one in heaven. I say this, brothers, flesh and blood cannot receive the kingdom of God, nor does decay receive indestructibility. Look, I tell you a mystery. Not all of us will fall asleep, but will all be changed, in an instant, in the blink of an eye, at the last trumpet. That is what Paul wrote roughly 20 years after the death of Jesus. Note that Paul explicitly says the resurrected Jesus was a spirit, and that flesh and blood cannot enter the kingdom. In fact, earlier, Paul had even said that our resurrected body will not have a stomach and so will not eat food. And here he adds that it will be completely indestructible. That's what Paul says, and that is clearly how he understood the resurrection to be. Yet this contradicts what Luke and John say. Luke claims that Christ said, "A spirit does not have flesh and bones as you see I have," and then he eats some fish to prove it. John claims the resurrected body of Jesus was still wounded, which cannot be if it was indestructible. So from Paul we learn that Jesus was a spirit and had no stomach, and thus wouldn't eat, that his body could not be blemished, and that it did not consist of flesh or blood, but of some spiritual heavenly substance. Yet Luke and John claim Jesus did eat, did have blemishes, did consist of flesh and blood, and was not a spirit. Our earliest and most reliable record says one thing, and our later record says exactly the opposite. One of them must be wrong, and most likely it's the later, less secure sources that have it wrong. Number 2, Paul omits these very crucial claims of Luke and John. It is more probable that those claims were contrived after Paul's time than that they existed at the very origin of the church, and yet Paul had never heard of them. Since his discussion here in 1 Corinthians concerned answering questions about the nature of the resurrection body, it is hardly conceivable that Paul would fail to cite the most powerful and relevant evidence, physical eyewitness encounters revealing exactly what that body was like. Number 3, Paul declares that Christ's resurrection was just like ours will be, but he describes our resurrection in terms that can only be understood as exchanging one body for another, not changing the same body into something else. Paul explicitly says, the body that dies is not the body that will rise, but God provides its own body. Paul takes great pains to explain that there are many different bodies, especially between bodies in heaven and on earth, and that our new bodies will be spiritual bodies, composed of the same stuff of the glorious stars. Paul goes out of his way to assert that the spiritual body comes after the natural body that dies. In all this, he specifically avoids ever simply saying that the natural body will become a spiritual body. He doesn't say that. His whole discourse emphasizes difference in substance and origin. Dust belongs to the earth, spirit belongs to heaven. It follows that the body of dust must be left behind, that this is the only way to enter the heavenly realm of the indestructible. As Paul says, we will put on our new bodies like new coats, suggesting the old coat will be left behind. In fact, in Paul's phrase, will all be changed, he uses the Greek word allagesamatha, which does not mean change in the sense of changing one thing into another, but is instead the verb of mercantile exchange, of trading one thing for another. This two-body doctrine was the view held by the Essene Jews, the one sect that had the most in common with the early Christian church. And it was also held by a prominent first-century Jew, Josephus, a Pharisee who specifically explains that our current bodies are inevitably corruptible and must return to the earth from which they came. So God will give us new, better bodies in the resurrection. Philo, another Jew and a contemporary of Paul, also held to a similar view. And Josephus and Philo often use the very same concepts and language as Paul. Thus, there is a good probability that Paul shared their view and understood the resurrection just as they did, as an exchange of an old shell of a body for a new heavenly body. This would explain one peculiar fact about the letters of Paul, why he never once mentions the empty tomb or any details of the empty tomb story. Because the tomb wasn't empty. Rather, the corpse was empty, for the spirit of Jesus had been transported into a new body in heaven, just as Josephus, Philo, and the Essenes all believed would happen, and just as Paul seems to have described. Now, later stories in the Gospels about an empty tomb and appearances are the only evidence Mike has against my theory. But my theory is based on earlier and more reliable evidence, has precedence in early Jewish thought, and already has the greater probability. It is the best and simplest explanation for what Paul both says and doesn't say. But there is more evidence that the empty tomb story is, more probably than not, a legend, which probably began as a literary symbol and not a claim to historical fact, and that the original appearances were more probably than not ordinary religious visions, later embellished to support the Sarcicist dogma. So now to those facts. Number 4. Throughout history, we have found that the frequency of amazing but true stories is low, very low. Such stories are rare, while the frequency of myths, legends, and tall tales is very high. Such stories are common. It follows that the probability that any amazing story will be false is higher than the probability it will be true. That doesn't mean every amazing story is false, only that this is more likely. Nor does this mean that we can never prove an amazing story true. only that we need especially strong evidence to overcome their low probability. In contrast, my theory rests on what is already the most probable, given what we know about history in general. Number 5. There is insufficient evidence to overcome the low probability that the empty tomb story is true. Being an amazing story, it is already likely to be false. To prove it is not, we need some good evidence. But the evidence we have is not at all good. In fact, it is among the worst we can have for any historical claim. There are 5 kinds of evidence we can have in history, and the more and better evidence we have from this list, the more certain we can be that a claim is true. As an example, I will compare the claim that the tomb of Jesus was found empty with the claim that Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon. First, the physical historical necessity of this event is exceedingly great. The history of Rome could not have proceeded as it did had Caesar not physically moved an army into Italy. He could not have captured Rome or conscripted Italian men against Pompey's forces in Greece. In contrast, the discovery of an empty tomb is not necessary, for as we have seen, the original belief may well have been that Jesus switched bodies and appeared in visions. That would be sufficient to get the religion started. Thus, an empty tomb is not necessary to explain all subsequent history, unlike Caesar's crossing of the Rubicon. Second, in Caesar's case, we have lots of direct physical evidence. We have a number of inscriptions and coins produced soon after the Republican Civil War related to the Rubicon crossing. In contrast, we have no physical evidence of any kind supporting the empty tomb. No papyri survive, and no inscriptions were commissioned by the resurrected Jesus, or by the early church, or by witnesses like Peter or Joseph of Arimathea. Third, for Caesar, we have unbiased corroboration. Even Caesar's enemies, like Cicero, reported the crossing of the Rubicon, as did other hostile or neutral observers, whereas we have no hostile or even neutral records of an empty tomb by any non-Christian until well after the Christians started telling the story, after Paul's death, and long after any facts could be checked. Fourth, we have several critical accounts of the Rubicon crossing by known scholars of the time, Suetonius, Appian, Cassius Dio, Plutarch. And we know a lot about who they were and their scholarship. They often quote and name many different sources, showing a wide reading of witnesses and documents, and they critically examine several disputed claims. They also cite or quote texts written by witnesses and contemporaries, hostile and friendly, of the Rubicon crossing and its repercussions. In contrast, we have not even a single skilled historian mentioning the empty tomb until centuries after the fact, while of those who mention the empty tomb within the 1st century, none show any wide reading, never name any sources, show no sign of a skilled or critical examination of conflicting claims, have no detailed scholarship to their credit that we can test for their skill and accuracy, are essentially unknown, and have an overtly declared bias towards persuasion and conversion. Fifth, there is an eyewitness account, for we have Caesar's own word on the subject. Indeed, the book The Civil War has been a Latin classic for 2,000 years. In contrast, we have nothing written by Jesus, nor any record of the empty tomb by eyewitnesses like Peter. And we do not know for certain the name or identity of any author of any of the accounts of the empty tomb that we do have, much less the name of any of their immediate sources. It should be clear that we have many reasons to believe Caesar crossed the Rubicon, all of which are lacking in the case of the empty tomb. In fact, when we compare all 5 points, we see that in 4 of them, the empty tomb has no evidence at all, and in the one proof that it does have, it has not the best, but the very worst kind of evidence, a handful of late, biased, uncritical, unscholarly, unknown, second-hand witnesses. That's not good evidence. Even seen in the best possible light, the evidence available is simply not sufficient to establish that there really was an empty tomb. Number 6, the Gospels themselves show signs of an increasing rate of legendary development. Of newfangled Gospels containing false claims, including myths and clever fabrications. We should certainly expect this only grew worse after Paul's day, when our Gospels were finally written. The first Gospel, Mark, tells a simple story about women going to the tomb and finding it open, meeting a single boy in white, then running off. The whole account is probably a parable and never intended to be read as history. But in the Gospel of Matthew, which simply borrowed from Mark and added to it, the boy has become an angel descending from heaven. The women experience a massive earthquake and watch the angel descend and see it open the tomb. Guards have been added to the story, and the women run off but now get to meet Jesus on the way. Can we doubt that we are looking at extensive legendary embellishment upon what began as a much more mundane story? We can see the same trend in Luke. Mark's one boy in white has been multiplied into two men who suddenly appear in dazzling apparel. Now we hear that Peter went to check the tomb and confirmed it was empty, and Jesus appears in the flesh and invites his disciples to touch him and eats fish to prove he's real, then whooshes up into heaven before their very eyes. That again sounds like a pretty fancy embellishment of Mark's far more humble story. In John, Jesus receives an absurdly fabulous burial. Peter again goes to see for himself, but this time yet another disciple goes too. Luke's two men now become two angels, and we get the elaborate tale of the doubting Thomas putting his fingers inside the wounds on Christ's body and Jesus declaring, "Blessed are they who believe without seeing." All this certainly looks like a growing legend. Number 7, we have found that genuine supernatural encounters must be extraordinarily rare, since despite 200 years of detailed scientific investigation, we have yet to confirm a single genuine case. In contrast, across the whole spectrum of human history and culture, inspiring religious dreams and hallucinations are quite common. Indeed, they are most frequent in cultures that elevate the status of such experiences, like the ancient world. And we have numerous examples of powerful dreams and hallucinations of pagan deities. We have also established the psychological and neurophysical basis of religious hallucination. It follows that the probability any appearance of God will really be a dream or hallucination is much higher than the probability of a genuine encounter with God. That doesn't mean every such encounter is false, only that this is more likely. Nor does this mean that we can never prove such an encounter genuine, only that we need especially strong evidence to overcome its low probability. In contrast, my theory rests on what is already the most probable, given what we know about human nature, the human brain, and the history of religions and ancient culture. Number 8, Paul describes the appearances of Jesus in terms more consistent with a vision than a physical body. He places himself on the list of witnesses to the risen Christ, along with Peter, James, and everyone else. And in Paul's letter to the Galatians, he says, "I neither received the gospel from a man, nor was I taught it, except through a revelation of Jesus Christ." A revelation, he specifically says, was not an encounter with flesh and blood. And the book of Acts describes Paul's experience as a vision, just a light and a voice, commonplace features of hallucination. That our earliest and best evidence would be of this character, while the only evidence of a more physical encounter with Jesus comes much later from much less secure sources, is more probable if the original experiences were in fact like Paul's vision, and less probable if they were like what some Gospels strive to depict. Number 9, Mark and Matthew don't mention Jesus appearing in the flesh, and Luke and John share the detail that Jesus suddenly appeared and disappeared on some occasions, as one would expect of a vision, and on other occasions appeared as someone else whose face no one recognized, which was a common motif in ancient religion, the god or angel appearing in disguise to test us. In contrast, details supporting a resurrection of the flesh arise only in Luke, and then appear in John, who is not an independent source since he borrowed many unique scenes from Luke. That our only evidence for a resurrection of the flesh would be entirely traceable to only one source, which we know came later than and embellished upon a source excluding those details, is more probable if it's a late fabrication and less probable if it was part of the original tradition. So those are the 9 facts that support my theory more than Mike's. There's a lot more, but I've outlined the main reasons for believing as I do. That we would have those facts rather than others is more probable if my theory is true, and less probable if Mike's theory is true. So the theory that visions inspired a belief that Jesus had been transported into the new heavenly body of the promised resurrection fits all 9 facts better than any other theory. Now, obviously, we can construct some elaborate hypothesis to explain away all this evidence, but my explanation will still remain the simplest and thus the most probable, the one most loyal to what Paul himself says, and the one most consistent with known probabilities and all the actual facts of history. Thank you.
So we proceed according to plan. Now Mike Lacona has 10 minutes to respond to what he's just heard.
Thank you, Richard, for that opening statement. Richard and I agreed to exchange our opening statements a few weeks ago in order to provide a more focused and interesting debate. Thus, we've had some time to prepare our first rebuttals. Let me recap my argument for Jesus' resurrection. I presented 3 historical facts that are strongly evidenced and widely accepted by the large majority of scholars: Jesus' death by crucifixion, the empty tomb, and the beliefs of a number of people, both friend and foe, that Jesus had been resurrected and had appeared to them. I provided evidence for all of these and argued that Jesus' resurrection is the best explanation for those facts because it accounts for all of the facts, does so easily and without straying. I also pointed out that when all natural theories fail or are less likely than the resurrection, we're justified in concluding that a miracle has occurred when the data appear in a context charged with religious significance. I further showed that such a context exists with Jesus' resurrection and therefore significantly increases the probability of a miracle. Now let's look at Richard's theory. He grants that Jesus died and that the disciples had genuine experiences that they interpreted as being the risen Jesus. However, he holds that these can be accounted for by hallucinations or dreams. He also holds that the empty tomb is the result of later legendary development. He then presented 9 arguments to support it. Since I only have 10 minutes to reply, and since some of his arguments are repetitious, I'm going to categorize his 9 objections into 3 areas and address these. First, the first category is his philosophical objections. His 4th and 7th objections are nearly identical and concern frequency, probability. He says myths, hallucinations, and dreams are more frequent than amazing but true stories or genuine supernatural encounters. Thus, he says there's a greater probability that what we have here are myths, hallucinations, and dreams. But probabilities of this sort only work when blind processes are involved. They don't work if there is intention behind it. For example, your chances of losing the lottery are much greater than your chances of winning. However, if I rig the lottery so that your number will come up, your chances of winning become greater than your chances of losing. Thus, if a context exists where there's reason to believe God may want to act, the chances that we have a genuine miracle in our hands may be greater than they are for myth, dream, or hallucination, especially if other data point away from these, as they do. The prominent atheist philosopher Antony Flew comments, certainly, given some beliefs about God, the occurrence of the resurrection does become enormously more probable. His 5th argument is that the evidence for Jesus' resurrection is insufficient to overcome the low probability of a supernatural or amazing but true event. Not at all. We've already seen that frequency probability doesn't work when intentionality is present. Moreover, the evidence for Jesus' resurrection is good, contrary to Richard's claim that it is of the worst sort. His comparison with Caesar's crossing the Rubicon is seriously flawed and downright inaccurate on many of the things he said. For example, he speaks of the credibility of the Roman historians over the Gospels. Yet, classical historian A.N. Sherwin-White of Oxford writes that the Roman historians disagree amongst themselves in the wildest possible fashion, both in major matters and in specific details. Sherwin-White adds that the Roman historians are no better than the Gospels. Now, I don't have time to address this further in this rebuttal, but I hope to bring it up in my next one. Richard says we need especially strong evidence to overcome low probability. I believe we have such evidence for Jesus' resurrection. But the requirement of especially strong evidence to overcome low probability cuts both ways. Remember, he proposed hallucinations or dreams. His theory requires group hallucinations, which most psychologists agree are impossible, and hallucinations experienced by his enemies who are unlikely to have been in the frame of mind to hallucinate. All of this makes his theory very improbable as well as ad hoc. Thus, by his own criteria, he's going to need extraordinary evidence to support his extraordinary claims. The second category involves his criticisms of the Gospels. His 6th and 9th arguments concern details in them. Now, I'd be happy to address these later, but because I'm pressed for time, for now I'll simply point out that this argument is entirely moot, since virtually all of the evidence I provided is from Paul and the Kerygma, data that predate the Gospels by decades. The third category of his objections relate to Paul. His 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 8th arguments have to do with Paul's interpretation of what happened to Jesus. He went to 1 Corinthians 15 and argued that Paul held that when Christians die, they exchange their old bodies for a new one, a spiritual one. On the other hand, I've proposed the orthodox view, which states that the body that is buried is the same body that will be raised and transformed into an immortal body. Did Paul support Richard's exchange theory? or the Orthodox transformation view. Well, I'm going to go through the same passage quickly. We'll look carefully at the Greek, and we'll see where Richard clearly misunderstands Paul at numerous and crucial points. In this passage, Paul is answering the question, what will our future bodies be like? He starts off by saying, so is the resurrection of the dead. It is sown, it is raised. When Paul says, so is the resurrection of the dead is in the plural in Greek. In other words, the dead ones, or those who have died. But the very next term is in the singular. It is sown, it is raised. He's referring to our present body, and there's continuity. In other words, what goes down in burial comes up in resurrection. It's a transformation, not an exchange. Paul says, it is sown a natural body, and it is raised a spiritual body. Richard interprets the meaning of the Greek word for spiritual, pneumatikos, as something of a different substance, a heavenly substance. Would you like to know how many times this Greek word refers to the material makeup of something as Richard holds? 0. With the lone possible exception of Ephesians 6:12, which isn't clear, it never appears in that sense, at least not in Paul or the New Testament. This is easily discovered or checked with the precision using a premier software program like BibleWorks. Now, we're fortunate that Paul uses the same 2 words for natural and spiritual earlier in the same letter. In chapter 2, verse 14, he says, the natural man does not accept the things that come from God because they are spiritually discerned. Here Paul mentions the natural man, or those governed by their fleshly and sinful desires with spiritual truths, holy, pure, and related to God. Thus later in chapter 15, Paul is saying that our current body is sown with all of its fleshly and sinful desires and raised with holy, pure, and desires centered on God. There's nothing here in support of an interpretation that refers to a different bodily makeup. Thus, the exchange theory is not supported here either. In the next verse, Paul refers to Adam as a living soul and Jesus as a life-giving spirit. The words Paul used for soul and spirit are the roots for the same 2 words we just discussed. This rules out any hopes of interpreting Paul as suggesting a different material makeup of the body. Moreover, the word for life-giving, zoepoiao, is used by Paul in Romans 8:11, where he says, the Spirit who raised Jesus from the dead will also give life, zoepoiao, to your mortal bodies. Notice Paul says the life-giving Spirit will give life to our mortal bodies. Since Paul uses the same Greek word on the same subject of our future bodies, it is clear that transformation is meant, not an exchange. Richard objects that in verse 50, Paul says, flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God, and in doing so contradicts Luke, who has Jesus saying a spirit does not have flesh and bones, as you see I have. But here again, he has failed to grasp the linguistics of the passage. Greek exegete D.A. Carson notes that the term flesh and blood was a common Jewish expression referring to man as a mortal being. A BibleWorks search reveals that the term appears 5 times in the New Testament and twice in intertestamental writings, all with the meaning of being mortal. Thus, Paul is not at all contradicting Luke, and once again, there is nothing here hinting at an exchange. Finally, Richard says that in verses 51 and 52, Paul uses the term allegosamatha, which does not mean change in the sense of changing one thing into another thing, I'm quoting him, but is instead the verb of mercantile exchange, of trading one thing for another. Folks, this is a half-truth and the wrong half. All anyone has to do is go to the major Greek lexicons such as Liddell Scott, BDAG, and Kittle's Theological Dictionary of the New Testament, and you'll discover, contrary to Richard's claim, that the primary meaning of the term is to change, to alter. The mercantile definition of trading one thing for another is a secondary definition. In fact, BDAG and TDNT list 1 Corinthians 15 under the primary definition of altering. Liddell Scott is silent on the verse. In conclusion, we've seen that the evidence for Jesus' resurrection is very good, and Richard's arguments fail, leaving him without a perch on which to roost. His theory is far from being simple, omits important considerations in his philosophical arguments, contains numerous and major inaccuracies, strains the Greek in order to accommodate him, is ad hoc, and has less explanatory power than the theory that Jesus rose, and therefore should be rejected. Thank you.
And now for Carrier's first rebuttal. Thank you.
I agree with Mike on two of his three facts. Probably Jesus died, and then probably his most ardent followers sincerely believed they had seen him. But I do not agree we have good evidence there was an empty tomb. First, Mike's Jerusalem factor carries no weight against my theory, since I have given you several good reasons to think the original Christians did not believe the tomb was empty, but that the corpse was empty of the Spirit of Jesus, which had poured itself into a completely new body in heaven. The Jews or Romans could not respond to such a claim by pointing to the old body. Second, Mike is correct that most Jews only regarded as a resurrection a bodily event, but that is also irrelevant, since I am arguing that it was indeed believed to be a bodily event, it just didn't involve the body in the tomb. And third, Mike is incorrect when he says that Jesus' enemies attest to the empty tomb. We do not have a single document by any enemy of Christianity from the first century even alluding to an empty tomb. All we have is a claim by a single Christian, Matthew. And I'm pretty sure that Matthew made that up. I'll say more on these points presently. But first, I pause to address an issue I didn't have time to explore in my opening, which is why Paul converted. As to the disciples and any family members who would be shattered by the terrible death of Jesus, I believe a series of grief-induced hallucinations, strongly inspired by religious fervor, fatigue, stress, or fasting, and the contemplation of things Jesus said and the searching of hidden meanings in Scripture to make some sense of the tragedy, could all have conspired to produce an affirming experience of a vindicated Jesus. There is nothing peculiar in such events involving groups. Several cases have been documented. Suggestion and memory contamination are well understood. Though all may have been seeing something different, all would believe they were seeing the same thing, only in their own way, especially if there was a strong leader guiding them in their interpretation of what was happening. I could say a lot more about this, but my time is short. The main question is why Paul would have such an experience, since he was not inspired by grief at the death of Jesus. First, I should point out that this is exactly why Paul is unique, because his inspiring circumstances were unique. If God were really appearing to people, there is hardly any credible reason why he would appear to only to one persecutor rather than to all of them, or at least a lot of them. But if Paul's experience were natural rather than divine, then we should expect such an event to be rare, possibly even unique, and lo and behold, that appears to be the case. This point carries for the disciples, too. It is extremely improbable that a genuinely divine Jesus would appear to only a few people in only one tiny place and only one brief time. It is far more probable he would have appeared to everyone at all times, or at the very least, everyone who could be saved. That the religion began with private visions granted only to a privileged few, in a time and culture where this was common, is more consistent with it beginning like every other visionary religion, as a natural product of human culture, psychology, and physiology. As to what actually happened to Paul, we know very little, which leaves a lot of room for speculation. I believe Paul came to feel guilt at what he was doing to the Christians, which became all the more painful to him when he started to find the Christian teaching appealing, especially its social program of moral reform. I argue in a forthcoming article of the Journal of Higher Criticism why this program was very appealing, even to outsiders like Paul. But to join this movement for a better society, Paul had to convert. The stress from worrying how to rationalize joining this program, and from his guilt at having treated so horribly those with such noble intentions, and the ensuing fatigue of losing sleep over this and traveling on a long, desolate road, could easily have conspired in his case to induce an affirming hallucination, his subconscious mind producing for him the very thing he most wanted, a sincere motive to repent and become a leader rather than a persecutor of the movement he'd come to admire. So I see no difficulty in appealing to ordinary religious hallucination. My theory agrees with what we know about the neurophysics, the psychology, and the anthropology of religious experience throughout the world, and it does not contradict anything we read from Paul himself. That said, I'd like to return to the 2 points I made earlier. First, Josephus, who, like Paul, was a Pharisee, wrote that the bodies of all men are truly mortal. They are created out of corruptible matter. But the soul is forever immortal and is a part of God that inhabits our bodies. When people exit this life, then the souls that remain pure and obedient obtain from God the holiest place in heaven, and from there, after the completion of the ages, once again they are sent instead into pristine bodies. Elsewhere, Josephus says God has granted that we be recreated and get a better life after the revolution. And in another passage, he explains, The Pharisees say that though every soul is incorruptible, only the soul of good men crosses over into another body. There can be no mistaking what Josephus is saying. We will get completely new bodies in the resurrection, for our present bodies can do nothing but return to dust. The doctrine of Philo and the Essene Jews was more complicated, but it amounts to nearly the same view. And Paul uses the same kind of language as they do, not only in 1 Corinthians 15, but elsewhere. In Philippians, for example, Paul does not say our bodies will change. He says God will change the form of our bodies to share the same form of Christ's body. And he uses the same word Josephus sometimes uses to refer to changing clothes. And in the same passage, Paul says our place of citizenship exists in the heavens, while our present body belongs to a lowly state. The exact same ideas are found in Philo and the Essenes. Then, in 2 Corinthians 4, Paul says, though our outer man is decaying, yet our inner man is being renewed. Because the things that can be seen are temporary. It's the things that can't be seen that are eternal. So Paul says the body we see is not eternal. Only the spiritual body, which we can't yet see, is eternal. And then in 2 Corinthians 5, Paul says, we know that if our earthly house of a body is torn down, we have a building from God, a house made without hands, eternal in the heavens. For indeed, in our present body we groan, longing to be clothed with our dwelling from heaven. And if we do get undressed, we will not be found naked. For while we are in the body, we groan because we are weighed down. And for this reason we do not want to undress, but to put something on, so what is mortal may be swallowed up by life. This is quite explicit. Our earthly body will be torn down and taken away, and we will be given a new heavenly body. And everything Paul says here is almost exactly what Philo and the Essenes say. The clincher is this. Mike cites N.T. Wright's monumental treatise on this subject, but evidently Mike didn't read it. I quote from that very book. Wright says, it is no doubt right that Paul can envisage here the possibility of exchange, losing one body, getting another one, rather than addition. Two of the greatest Christian scholars in antiquity agreed, Origen and John Philippon. Today, several experts share this view. C.F.C. Moulay, Gregory Riley, Dale Martin, Adela Collins, Peter Lamp. So my theory is more than plausible. Then there is the accusation of theft. Peculiar verbal and structural clues in Matthew's narrative prove that Matthew transformed Mark's narrative into a new version of the story of Daniel in the lion's den. Making that parallel fit required the placing of a seal on the tomb to match the placing of a seal on Daniel's den. And the placing of a seal required the placing of guards, and the placing of guards requires an accusation of theft. We can know this is all fiction because none of the other gospel accounts of the empty tomb make the presence of guards at all possible. And no other document, independent of Matthew, ever mentions the claim. Not even Acts, despite the fact it depicts numerous Jewish attacks against the nascent church, so it is most peculiar that Luke had never heard of their accusation of theft. Most peculiar of all, in actual Jewish documents, only the legitimacy of Jesus is challenged. The most biting Jewish polemic in the Talmud hugely contradicts the gospel accounts of the trial of Jesus, and yet still they saw no need to counter the claim of an empty tomb. That's just bizarre, unless there was no such claim to counter. We might also add that in Jewish legend, the Roman general Titus cast a necromantic spell to summon the spirit of Jesus for questioning. We happen to know such a spell required the skull of the deceased, which entails the Jews believed, at least, the skull of Jesus was available, which suggests they did not believe the tomb was empty. Finally, I believe Mark invented the empty tomb story as a symbolic parable and not a claim to historical fact. Mark says Jesus declared, I will destroy this holy residence made by hands, and in 3 days build another house not made by hands, clearly referring to his resurrection. Yet he says he will not raise the same body, but build a new one, not made by hands, exactly as Paul said. So Mark doesn't really believe the tomb was empty. He only uses it as a metaphor. I have several good reasons for believing this, which unfortunately I haven't time to explain right now. But many of Mike's objections, such as why Mark has women finding the tomb instead of men, are required by Mark's mythic structure. For example, it fulfills the prediction of Jesus that the least shall be first. Thank you.
Once again, Mike Licona.
Thanks. In Richard's first rebuttal, he said that he agreed with that Jesus died and that his believers were convinced that they saw him. He attacked, but he doesn't believe in the empty tomb. He says the Jerusalem factor that I presented carries no weight because he showed that the Jews didn't believe resurrection. Well, I don't think he did that. He tried to show that Paul didn't believe in resurrection, but we showed that he was flawed in the way he said that because of his misunderstanding of the Greek and Paul at very specific and crucial points. Well, he says that there were no enemy documents to the empty tomb, and thus we couldn't use enemy attested. Well, he says that, in fact, he thinks it's only in Matthew, and that Matthew made it up. Well, I'd like to know where his evidence is for that. He didn't provide any. He just made an unsupported, unsubstantiated claim. Sure, he just made it up. Let's not provide any evidence. Then he said, well, the disciples experienced grief hallucination. Well, this doesn't account for the empty tomb, which I said I think is strongly supported, and it is largely acknowledged by scholarship today, an impressive 75%. If they were experiencing grief hallucinations, it wouldn't account for the appearances to the skeptic James, who wouldn't have been grieving, and it wouldn't account to for Paul, who wouldn't have been grieving either. Well, he said, yeah, but Paul was guilty. He felt guilty about what he was doing. Well, there's no evidence for that either. In fact, Paul seemed to be proud of his resume that's presented in Philippians chapter 2. As to zeal, a persecutor of the church, he said. Well, then he says, well, it's improbable that Jesus appeared to only a few. Well, how does he know that? Well, what kind of probability calculus is he basing that theory upon? How does he know why Jesus would only appear to that? The fact is that Jesus appeared to people, at least people who were his followers did, a number of them did, to both individuals and groups, and he appeared to one enemy at least, and probably even a skeptic. Well, then he mentions Paul in 2 Corinthians 5:14, and he said that Paul had this exchange in mind, and he said, well, I probably didn't even read N.T. Wright's book. Well, I did, and I would encourage Richard to go back to that passage because N.T. Wright in that very passage says it's very tough, and scholars disagree almost down the line, 50-50, on what Paul is really saying here. And he quotes Martin Hengel, if I recall properly. It's been about 6, 7, 9 months since last July since I read the book. But I think he quotes Martin Hengel as saying it's just really difficult, and scholars really disagree on this passage and what it's really saying. But he goes on to say that we need not think that Paul was referring to the spiritual body, and here's why. We showed very definitely that Paul was referring to a bodily resurrection, a transformation, not an exchange, in 1 Corinthians 15. Even if Richard was right here in his interpretation that he's talking more of an ethereal body in 2 Corinthians, just 1 year later, Paul writes Romans, which he very specifically in Romans 8:11 talks about bodily resurrection of the same body. Remember, the Spirit who raised Jesus from the dead will also give life, zoe poieo, to your mortal bodies. There's no question that transformation is what is being referred to here. Well, he quotes Josephus there. Yeah, I admit that Josephus, this passage is tough, but he doesn't say resurrection here either. He's just saying that this was his view of what happened in the afterlife. Now, I contacted Louis Feldman on this. Louis Feldman is perhaps the greatest living Josephus scholar today, and he's a Jewish scholar. And Feldman wrote me back and said that, and I quote, this passage does seem to me to talk about reincarnation in a new body. Though he deals with Daniel at length, he does not refer to Daniel 12:1-3, which speaks of resurrection. I wonder about this because in Life 12, he identifies politically with the Pharisees, who certainly in the Talmud, Mishnah Sanhedrin 10:1, regard the belief in resurrection as a cornerstone of Judaism. Perhaps he believed in both reincarnation and resurrection. Besides, the whole thing is moot what Josephus and Philo and the Essenes believed. We know that the Jews had a number of different beliefs regarding the afterlife. I pointed that out in my opening statement. Remember the Sadducees. They didn't believe in resurrection at all. They just believed that when you died, that was it. The question is, what did the earliest Christians believe? And we see very clearly from the earliest Christian writer, Paul, that they believed in resurrection of the same body. It was a transformation. This is further confirmed in the very passage which Richard quoted from Paul, Philippians 3:21, where it says, We eagerly wait a Savior, the Lord Jesus, who will transform. The word transform is used there. It's not a changing of clothes. It's a transformation. Who will transform. What's he going to transform? Our lowly, humble bodies into conformity with his glorious body. Again, it's not an exchange. It's a transformation. Well, then he talked about, he said, the guards. He says, well, I don't think that this is authentic. Well, there are some good arguments for a Jewish polemic here, Jewish Christian polemic that says, Jesus rose from the dead, Jewish response. No, the disciples stole the body, Christian response. They couldn't have because the guards at the tomb, Jewish response. No, the guards fell asleep, Christian response. No, the chief priest paid them to say that. And so when you look at this, we can see that perhaps there is some good evidence for the guards there. Besides, my argument didn't rest on the guards anyway. He said, well, the Talmud contradicts the Gospels on Jesus. Well, the Talmud is late. It's hundreds of years after Jesus, and most believe, even Jewish historians, that this is just a polemic against the Christians of those days. It's not trying to accurately report the historical Jesus. Well, he says Mark invented the empty tomb as a parallel, and it's not a historical fact at all. Well, I believe he's taking this because from Dennis MacDonald in his book, The Homeric Epics in the Gospel of Mark, which he writes on and endorses online. But this view is both irrelevant and wrong. It's irrelevant because Mark is decades later than the oral tradition in Paul that I quoted, which comes decades before. It's wrong because many times MacDonald has to strain and contort the text to find his parallels, especially when he comes to the death, burial, and resurrection. For example, in the Iliad, Hector's body is burned and his tomb holds his remains forever, while Jesus' body is resurrected 3 days later. Resurrection is mentioned 3 times in the Iliad, twice regarding its impossibility and once in the metaphor of Hector's avoidance of certain death. Mark differs in a million ways from Homer. In fact, in order to account for this, MacDonald claims that Mark, and I quote, Mark hid his dependence by avoiding Homeric vocabulary, transforming characterizations, motifs, and episodes, placing the episodes out of sequence, and employing multiple literary models, especially from Jewish scriptures, end quote, page 170. In other words, MacDonald is claiming that all of the characteristics the historian would look for in order to show a borrowing are absent because Mark changed everything intentionally in order to keep from being detected. Well, using this kind of answer, we might accuse any author of copying from any other author of our choice. Are we surprised to find then that MacDonald's thesis has not gained much of a following? In fact, the Robert Rabel, the professor of Greek and Roman history literature at the University of Kentucky, comments that one can discern literally hundreds of close parallels between the Iliad and, say, Clint Eastwood's movie, Unforgiven. So we've seen that these failed. I got 2 minutes left. Let me see if I can touch on this Rubicon comparison real quickly, and I'll take the more important points. He says that we have direct physical evidence for Caesar's crossing the Rubicon, such as inscriptions and coins. Yet he says there's nothing of the sort for Jesus' resurrection. Well, we have an empty tomb. We have documents written by even enemies. Well, coins would be nice, but since the Roman Empire was killing Christians at that time, I don't think we can expect a commemorative coin sept in honor of Jesus. Moreover, if he rose from the dead, we wouldn't find bones or a bone box. I don't know what else he wants, a photo? Well, if the Shroud of Turin is authentic, we have that too. He says, Caesar, we have unbiased corroboration, since even his enemies, Cicero, reported the event. Well, we have 2 enemies, Paul and James, who reported a post-mortem appearance of Jesus to them. And Paul was certainly more hostile toward Christians than Cicero was to Caesar. Well, he mentions bias. Well, bias doesn't mean false information. In one of his articles, Richard refers to religion as socially acceptable insanity. That's clear bias against religion. Should we therefore reject everything he's saying here this evening? I don't think so. We simply need to be aware of the bias of the writer, and for our own for that part, and then proceed with caution. He says that several credible accounts of the Rubicon event by known scholars of the time, whereas no one historian reports the resurrection of Jesus. First, Richard underestimates the reliability of the Gospels. The historical accuracy of Luke and John have many times been corroborated by archaeological finds. He also overestimates the greatness of the Roman historians he cites. For example, Suetonius is indiscriminate in his use of sources. Plutarch is inaccurate at times and makes frequent use of anecdotal material, such as when he said that Alexander the Great descended from Hercules. Appian is known for his many inaccuracies. Cassius Dio contradicts himself as well as embellishes, changes, and combines facts in order to be more dramatic. Pliny the Younger, just a few pages after one of the works that Richard quotes, mentions dog-headed apes, 5-year-old girls who give birth, a woman who gave birth to an elephant, 12 feet tall Ethiopians. These are the sources he's appealing to and say they're very credible over the Gospels. Moreover, all the Roman historians write 150 to 250 years after Caesar's crossing the Rubicon, whereas the reports of Jesus' resurrection start within 5 years of the event. Even the Gospels by critical dating are only 40 to 70 years later. So I don't think that we have some problems here with the Gospels. I think we still have good reason to believe that Jesus rose from the dead, just as we find in the earliest multiple enemy and embarrassing sources. Thank you.
Okay, it's time to go to the show. Here you go. 10 minutes now.
Slide 23, please. I argued that Mark invented the empty tomb story as a symbolic parable, not a claim to historical fact. There are 6 pieces of evidence for this conclusion, and I think it's important to go over them because they support the overall point that I've been making, that Mark is not writing history, so we cannot compare him in the same genre as historical sources. First, Mark's gospel is structured throughout with a constant theme of reversal of expectation. For example, Mark has Jesus tell Simon Peter to deny himself and take up his cross and follow. So we expect Simon Peter to carry Christ's cross. But Mark thwarts our expectations by having a completely different man named Simon carry Christ's cross, a stranger from Cyrene on the opposite side of Egypt, a symbol of death in Jewish lore. There are dozens of other examples like that. So Mark has to make the tomb empty to thwart our expectations, just as he has to defy our expectations by having women find the tomb instead of men to prove the words of Jesus that the least shall be first. Now, I'm going to go over these others as I go. Mike was debating against Dennis MacDonald's theory. I don't know why. I never brought it up. I don't necessarily support it. These facts here are not in MacDonald. These are completely separate facts. So rebutting MacDonald doesn't have any effect on what I'm talking about. Now, and also I should bring up the fact that he mentioned the inaccuracies and the unreliability of ancient historians. I agree with him, actually. Ancient historians are much worse than modern historians. But giving reasons we don't have evidence and showing that all the other sources of the ancient world were unreliable doesn't really rebut the fact that the sources are unreliable and we don't have good evidence. This is very important. But I'm going to go back to my list. Second, Mark's empty tomb narrative contains 6 linguistic and conceptual markers taken straight out of a popular competitor to Christianity, the Orphic Mysteries, which also taught salvation through a baptism that washes away sin. 6 markers in one place is too improbable to be a coincidence. One of the principal doctrines of Orphism was that our body was a tomb for the soul. Thus, it seems apparent that Mark is using the empty tomb to symbolize the empty body of Christ. And as I quoted earlier, Mark says that Jesus said that he would destroy the current body and build a completely new body, another body, not made by hands. So Mark's whole theme supports this. Third, Mark's entire passion narrative mimics the Messianic Psalms. Slide 27, please. His crucifixion narrative borrows 5 elements from Psalm 22, often quoting verbatim. Psalm 23 is the famous funeral psalm representing Christ's Sabbath day's sojourn in the valley of the shadow of death. And Psalm 24 celebrates the triumph of the Messiah over death on the first day of the week. The fact that Mark uses the exact same phrase on the first day of the week to introduce his empty tomb narrative demonstrates he is interpreting that psalm. The whole thing represents the gates of death opening and the Lord ascending to heaven, as it says in that psalm. So the empty tomb symbolizes Christ's ascension and escape from death. Back to slide 23, please. Fourth, Mark has the women ask who will roll away the stone, using a phrase copied nearly verbatim from the Genesis narrative of Jacob's fathering of the 12 tribes of Israel. In that story, a woman brings the sheep to be watered at Jacob's well. So Christ's tomb is a symbol of that well, whose opening also brings the water of life to the sheep of a new Israel. Fifth, Mark uses still more phrases borrowed from Ecclesiastes and Chronicles, depicting Jesus as the new King Asa, a famous reformer of Judaism. And sixth, we know Mark believed in the two-body resurrection doctrine because he says, as I said, that he would make another house not made by hands. That's that particular issue. He also brought up Romans 8:11, that he says that Paul claims God will raise our present bodies, but Paul is not talking about resurrection in that passage. He does not say God will raise our mortal bodies, nor does he say he will change our mortal bodies into immortal ones. Rather, the context of that verse, slide 62, please, context of verses 1 through 10 establish that Paul is talking about our lives in the here and now. He uses exactly the same language in Ephesians and Colossians when discussing our present experience of the kingdom, not our future resurrection. Paul says in all three places that we are made alive already because our bodies are already dead. Instead, Paul is otherwise quite explicit that our current bodies will be destroyed, not transformed. Slide 65, please. Besides the many passages I have already read to you, in 1 Corinthians 5, Paul says point blank that our flesh must be destroyed so our spirits can be saved. In Romans 7, Paul says he longs to be liberated from the flesh. In Colossians, Paul says our present bodies are the body parts we have on earth, in contrast to the lives we'll live with God. In 2 Corinthians 4, Paul says we now live in clay pots, using the technical term in Jewish law for pots that, once used, must be destroyed. The Bible calls these pots made by hands, in contrast with gold pots, which are superior and not made by hands. As I have already noted, both Paul and Mark call our resurrection body a body not made by hands. The evidence is overwhelming. Paul did not believe we would rise in our bodies of flesh. He clearly believed the flesh would be destroyed and we would get new, better bodies in the resurrection. Now, I'd like to bring up another point. I can't possibly cover every issue, unfortunately, in the limited time. But Mike says that we can infer a miracle in a situation when the intention is present, but that's a circular argument. It's precisely the issue to be proved, whether there was a God who had the intention to raise Jesus. There's no evidence of the supernatural to support this, to give it a grounding, versus plenty of very good evidence for hallucination and legendary development. Slide 77, please. This is basically how it breaks down. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. For example, I own a car means we have tons of evidence already because most people own a car, therefore minimal evidence is needed for Proposition 1. But I own a nuclear missile, well, there's not very much evidence there because few people own a nuclear missile, so a lot more evidence is needed for 2, the kind of evidence that would convince the CIA. Now, if I said I own an interstellar spacecraft, there's no evidence that such a thing even exists, so even much more evidence is needed for 3, the sort that would convince the entire United Nations. Now, this resurrection of the God appearing to people is the same category as category 3. We have never seen any scientific proof, any more scientific proof that God has actually appeared to people or that actually resurrects bodies than we have seen that there are interstellar spacecraft flying around. So that's what I'm talking about when I say we need really good evidence, but we don't have that kind of good evidence. Now, he also mentioned allogesamatha in the lexicon, saying that it means change, but that's the colloquial sense, like change clothes. Every single use of this word in the New Testament and the Septuagint means trade. For example, exchanging gods or exchanging customs or exchanging clothes. And to make this even clearer, and this makes the point even better, slide 66, please. Paul gets his word from a passage in the Psalms, the same passage that's used by Hebrews, which is also in the New Testament. It says, both passages, that the world will be destroyed. I want to make that point clear, destroyed and replaced. And it says the old one will wear out and be rolled up like a garment and traded in. Traded in, allogesamatha, in this case allogesantai, the third person, but nevertheless the exact same word, the exact same form as Paul uses in 1 Corinthians 15 of what happens to our bodies. Paul also refers to our bodies as garments, something we wear. And Mark uses garments as a symbol of body. With the young man who becomes naked in his narrative, that symbolizes losing the body of flesh. And the young man with the white robe represents getting the new resurrection body. Now, the fact that Paul gets this word from a passage that clearly talks about the universe being destroyed and being replaced supports my position here. And also the fact that every single use in the New Testament and the Septuagint is about trade is exactly why I come to the conclusion that Paul chose this word very carefully. And he never does say change the body. Even when in Philippians he says that he will change the form of our body to conform to the form of the body of Christ. And the word he uses, metaschematizo, as I said, is the same word used by Josephus for changing clothes. And we know that Paul, again, thinks of these bodies as two kinds of clothes that we swap in and out of. Now, Mike also mentioned that scholars disagree about the meaning of this passage 50-50. Well, okay, that means Mike can't claim to prove I'm wrong, so we can't be sure he's right either. I personally think the evidence is much stronger than that, but if it's 50-50, that's not a very good case. Now, he also says that 75% of scholars believe in an empty tomb. Well, that's not good enough either. 95% is your standard for a consensus. That means there's 25% of bona fide scholars out there, and I named several bona fide scholars, ancient and modern, who agreed in the same theory that the body is it's a situation of body exchange, not body change. Mike also mentioned that the spiritual body is sown. He said, it will be sown. Well, the word it is not in the Greek. The subject of the sentence is body, which is repeated twice. Thus, two bodies are meant. He also mentions flesh and blood. Slide 68, please. The only reason this phrase can mean mortal is that flesh and blood is mortal. That is precisely Paul's point. He says in the same sentence that decay cannot receive indestructibility. So he means mortal things like flesh and blood cannot receive immortality. That's the only sense, and that's the only reason why it would carry that same meaning. He also mentions pneumatikos. Slide 69, please. We have time? Okay, sorry. Don't have time to continue with that. Thank you.
Okay, as you can see, this is a subject that has many, many, many aspects, and many of them will not be able to be discussed tonight. But now in the next 5 minutes, each one will have the opportunity to wrap up what they're going to do. Have you decided? Who's going first? You just want to stay there and do it?
Yeah,
you ready?
Go right ahead.
You ready to go?
Ready to go? Yeah,
all right,
let's go.
Here you go. 5 minutes.
Slide 20, please. Okay, I've said there are many plausible theories contrary to what Mike has argued tonight, and I only had time to argue the case for one of them, and I didn't even get the chance to argue it completely. I wasn't able to rebut every single argument he brought up, but I could, and hopefully they'll come up in questions. The one I personally think is the most probable is this. Following what we know to be the ordinary course of religious experience and development throughout human cultures, the disciples dreamed or hallucinated a bodily encounter with Jesus and concluded he had been granted the new body of the resurrection, which all would share if they attached themselves to him. Originally, it was thought that he left the old body behind, but then the church fragmented into different beliefs and came up with the body of flesh idea, which we see in Luke. I've brought up 10 facts that support this theory. 1, Paul, our earliest and best source, talks about a spiritual resurrection. He's not saying desires. Desires is not an issue in there. He's all talking about bodies, different bodies, bodies in heaven, bodies on earth, different kinds of flesh, flesh of fish, flesh of humans. So when he finally comes to talking about bodies, he's clearly not talking about desires. He's talking about substance. He says the man is made of earth from heaven, or made of dust from the earth, and the other man is made from heaven, or comes from heaven. So clearly the context is about different bodies, different substances. And with any kind of Greek word, you have to look to the context. In this particular passage, the context is different bodies. And Paul says, point blank, that the body that dies is not, the body that is sown that dies is not the body that rises. Paul omits all the crucial claims of Luke and John that are the only evidence on record that Jesus rose in the flesh. Paul describes the resurrection in terms of exchanging one body for another, as I talked about. The body that dies is not the body that will rise. He says that. And the language he uses is exactly the same kind of language as Josephus, Philo, and the Essenes of different switching different bodies, of corruptible substances versus indestructible substances. Fourth, we know that the frequency of amazing but true stories is very low, and the frequency of myths and legends is very high. We don't have an adequate enough evidence to prove that the empty tomb is not a legend. Even Mike agrees that the ancient sources are so unreliable that we can't really trust them. And the Gospels are no better, certainly. 5, extraordinary evidence would be needed. He gives excuses for why we don't have the evidence, but that still means we don't have the evidence. It doesn't matter what reason we don't have enough evidence to believe. If we don't have enough evidence to believe, That's it. We don't have enough evidence to believe, even if we have excuses for why we don't have that evidence. 6, the Gospels themselves show signs of an increasing rate of legendary development. They get more fabulous and polemical over time. The whole flesh polemic appears in Luke, but Luke gets his original basic story from Mark, which doesn't contain that polemic. And as we saw, Mark tended to look at a two-body view of the resurrection. 7, we know genuine supernatural encounters must be extraordinarily rare. Once again, the whole point is we've never seen an example of this. We've never proven that there's anything supernatural. Even if there is a God, we have not proven that he intervenes in the course of events, that he appears to people, for example. Yet we have tons and tons of evidence of false appearances of God, of hallucinations, dreams, and so forth, from many different religions and cultures. So any particular claim where we see that there's some sort of visionary experience, such as Paul describes, the probability already is greater that it is a natural event and not a supernatural event. It's like finding that there's a supernatural interstellar spacecraft. The odds of that are just too low. And we would need really good evidence to overcome this, and we don't have that evidence. 8, Paul, our best source, describes Jesus in terms more consistent with a vision than a real physical encounter, and he never identifies any difference in nature between his experience and the disciples. His vision was a revelation of Christ. 9, Mark and Matthew don't mention Jesus being touched or eating food or whooshing up into heaven before gawking crowds or outright saying he wasn't a spirit. Only the later sources of Luke and John contain such details. Paul, of course, never mentions the empty tomb, never mentions any of the details regarding flesh, and yet we would expect him to when he's talking about the nature of the resurrection body. And also the several Gospels share the detail that Jesus suddenly appeared and disappeared and sometimes wasn't recognized, more consistent with visions than a physical body. All 9 of those facts are more probable if my theory is true and less probable if Mike's theory is true. Therefore, my theory is the best explanation of the facts we have. And there is a 10th fact. As I said, a real God would not have Jesus appear to only a select few in one tiny locale. That Christianity would begin in such a way is more probable if it began the way all religions do, with natural visions interpreted in a convenient way, and less probable if it began with a genuine act of God. And this I can emphasize as my final point. If God really loved us and really wanted to save us all, obviously, I know I would appear to all of you. I would come to all of you and explain the situation and lay the cards on the table. I wouldn't just appear to a few people, maybe a few hundred people at most, in the ancient world 2,000 years ago, and then stop. And then rely on those guys to come out and tell people, look, I saw God. Well, you're not going to see him, but I saw him, and listen to what I have to say. I find that highly improbable. A loving God, especially a God who was as compassionate as I am, would certainly appear to everyone at all times. He wouldn't rely on a human mission.
Okay.
Is that it? Thank you.
Yep, that's it. Thank you.